Okay, fantastic, guys. Thanks for getting here on time. I really appreciate it. Um, so let's kind of go over a little bit of our progress. This is the phase one deliverable that we're working on, and um, the idea is to kind of integrate a lot of the bootstrap that we have. So we're assuming that you're okay with CSS. We're assuming that you can use a CSS. We're also assuming that you've done some experimentation with Bootstrap, and we are saying that a great way to experiment with Bootstrap was in two places. One was just to find some simplistic examples where, for example, there's Bootstrap that's on the web. W3 Schools is a cheap and easy way to get started with things. And so we were doing a lot with this kind of cookbook where we were saying, go ahead, let's make a nav bar and let's make drop downs. And so W3 Schools is a great place to get started. It's not a great place to articulate. There's not sophistication there. It's a great place to get started. It's a cheap, easy way to get bootstrapped, if you will, started on a project. So we were saying, well, look, the first stage of the project involves making a drop-down navigational menu where a drop-down is present. So we're going to use a drop-down menu, and we're going to copy and paste this kind of code into a a piece of HTML. Sorry, it might need to get running. I'm running it on a Ubuntu file system. Let me get that up. And so we were saying, once you have a little bit of starter code, well, there's room to be more sophisticated. So we were saying go ahead and go to the docs inside of the get bootstrap, and we were saying there's the examples that are hard to duplicate. The examples are very full-fleshed, fully articulated pages, and they mean for these pages to act like a kitchen sink of sorts, where students will choose a style or something that they want to see. So for example, there are nav bars, I think, here. Drop downs, yep. And so there are really cool nav bar examples here. And so those are the examples. I think that they are for more experienced students to emulate those examples. So in the past, I've said to people, okay, let's go ahead and appropriate an example. And I found that now it's way easier for students to actually just hit the documents, hit the docs. So docs are probably the best example of Bootstrap that you can get out on the internet. So one of your problem solving tools is that you understand the basic HTML and then a client, and let's say you can practice having a client because you have this project. And a client will say, well, I want something that has this particular navigation. And so you can go ahead and try to emulate that by going ahead and locating, let's say, a navigation, and if I can locate it, nav bar. And so we were saying, well, you understand the basic building blocks of CSS, and you're fooling around with this. And here's a good example of a drop-down, and then by appropriating this HTML right here and then dropping that into your sample, you can begin the process of working out what you want to see. Of course, the drop-down is going to be within here. So let's go down. Let's locate more of the kind of nav that intrigues us or that interests us, something with a drop-down like this. We would go ahead and copy that, and then we drop it into our HTML. Now, this is part of the discipline where, oh, that's not showing up. Here, let's get that quit. Let's get that booted up. And then we'll wait for that to boot up. But partly we're trying to grab the core language. And we've said in the past, those of us here in Southern California, we like to engineer things from the ground up. So people have a lot of energy. People say, well, I don't want to buy a motorcycle. I want to make my own motorcycle. And I've met plenty of students who are saying, well, how can I make my own motorcycle? And we're kind of saying, well, we admire you, but probably you'll want to buy a motorcycle first so you can take it apart and understand it. And But with here, you're kind of grabbing a little bit of HTML and then you're incorporating it and you're studying how it works. So it's actually quite important to grab some HTML, implement it within your editor. And I'll reopen my editor because my Ubuntu is crashing. I have a lot of my file system on Ubuntu. Sorry about that. I'm going to wait for that to boot up. I'm going to have Ubuntu there. And so by having this HTML on hand, you can see what it looks like and then backtrack and say, well, that interests me. So a good example is here. This is a little bit of an example of a kitchen sink where the developers offered many variations on their language, and that's very good. So if you guys are going to the source of the engineer of the framework, that's really rigorous. That's really good. You have the greatest amount of freedom and flexibility and the greatest amount of options. And then also, I think if what a lot of members of your generation understandably are looking for is self-respect. Is you guys want to do it in a way where you admire your own outcomes. So going to the author of a framework and then using his or her examples means that you're doing about as good a job as you can, A, to offer yourself the amount of creative freedom, the greatest number of options, but then B, to do it in the most intellectually rich way. So I'm not saying to you go ahead and copy a bunch of stuff. I'm saying adapt and interpret what the language engineer has given you. And that's the way that professionals do it. There's really no way to copy and paste products when you get down to web development. When you're using anything from music to building highways to building homes, you're always taking a building material and you're using it in the way that it's intended, and then you're employing a level of architecture to get a result that benefits you. So the actual use of the building material is not as intellectual as your design and making something according to your design. That is harder than putting bricks together. Does that make sense? And bricks is hard enough. So in this example, what I'm doing is I'm analyzing the example by saying, well, maybe this is what intrigues me, and you can see that it adapts to the sizing. Maybe this is the kind of drop down that I want to see. How do I render something along those lines? Well, let's grab the containing element and let's study how that element, and let's expand that a bit. Let's study how that element plays out, and this is how we get the drop down item. So on one hand, you're going shopping. You're being quote unquote bougie and you are going shopping. You're like, I want to do what I want to do. I want to grab what I want, and I want to wow my client. Or maybe you're saying to the client, hey, choose for me the stuff that you like the most, and I'll make that for you. And then you're giving people that incredible array of choice, and then you're saying, well, whatever that is, I can make it. And the reason why is because you can go and inspect the underlying code. You understand what these mean. You're not intimidated by things like class. That comes from CSS. You're not intimidated by things like div. That's a box. Here are the computed layout for the box. Then you're not intimidated by things like A. You know that those are going to be functional pieces of text or anchor text that do things like links. So from there, you're kind of leveraging your assumptions. And so that is the way that navbar works. And the next piece of the assignment is to have a set of inputs with text next to them. One input should ask for a numeric value, the other should ask for textual value. Here is a nice implementation, and so we can follow that link. And this is a classic example on Bootstrap where it's showing you what a form looks like, and these are beautiful forms. And let's just face it, this looks better than a lot of websites that you've interacted with. If you put out something that looks like this, your clients are going to respect you, and they're going to give you some feedback as to how they might want things to be a little bit different. But if you can build something that looks like this, you're in a wonderful position where you're offering clients and corporations plenty of choice. And let me just say that when you're making creative work, it's a community where you're the creator, you have the ability to make things. But other people, they may have other roles, like a marketer, or they may have a CEO, or they may even be a customer, and they have their own perspective. They're not you, they're not the creator, but they will respect you insofar as you can shape your creation to their delight, to their cultural expectations, so that it fits something that appeals to them. So getting something finished is the first step to figuring out how to make other people happy. Because if you are okay with doing something and you're okay with adjusting or altering it, then you can collect that feedback and then shape things over time. And if you have those 3 or 4 different skills, i.e. A, creating, B, listening, C, integrating, and then D, reintegrating, changing your product, then people are going to appreciate you. And eventually you will create something great with another bunch of people. So I think having the ability to decompile, a web page such as this or this using the inspect, that's a very key skill that I've found and I'd like for you to get better at. And it also takes a little bit of the mystery out of the coding game, because I think people look at code and they say, well, do you need to memorize all that? And the answer is no, you don't memorize things. You memorize syntax. You understand the meaning of the structure of the language has more meaning than the individual terms. Over time, you will memorize. But once you've coded it for many days, weeks, years, then your memory will kick in. But you're not obligated to memorize anything right now. That's not meaningful. But having a structural comprehension of what's happening, that's where we want to be right now. So here we've made a drop-down nav. Then we want to make a set of inputs. Now, we could make something complex like this, where we could say inspect, and then we could go in and kind of analyze this happens on a form, and that form, firstly we have a row, and then inside of a row we have a column, and then inside of that we have a titling, and we can break it apart. Then we have a form, and inside of the form we have another div where we have input types. And so if we sit still there for a moment and say, well, Mr. Bunn wants me to make a set of inputs. These inputs are the kind of thing that are driving the assignment. So we have an input group. Maybe we have a form right here. And on top of the form, inside of that, we have a row. And for every row, we have a series of columns. And we can use the columns to make a perfect separation. And then if we drop into a column, we might have a label or a text input. These text input happen to be exactly what we're interested in. And you'll see that in our requirements, we're asking for one input should ask for a numeric value, the other just textual values. That comes from doing this organization, where you have invalid input, where you need to have you actually need to have text in there. Does that make sense? So if you don't fill it in, it will say, hey, it'll complain. Others of them have numeric feedback that are needed. But you can see that there's a column. Inside the column, there's a label. Next to that, there is an input. So just understand that. That's kind of what we're looking for. Now, I'll say this. Looking at an example is more intellectually laborious than looking at the docs. And let's be honest, using documentation is part of what makes us effective. Getting something finished in 15 or 20 minutes, that's actually very important. And the reason why is so that you can get feedback from people. Say, oh, I like the style. Oh, that's great. That's the right direction. The faster you can collect input from your audience, the faster you're going to make a nice product, and the faster you're going to feel the impact of that. Inside of the docs, we can actually find a form control. Input group, that'll be fine. That's very similar. And this will give us an example, and it will give us, the form is different because it's an input group that's inside of a div. And so a form control is actually, um, it's a little bit similar to this example where there's a form control here. You can see form control is inside of that div. And as I go down, you'll see there's other form controls here too. So that's an input group. And the input group is this combination. So I think this is a really intellectual thing for young people to do. And it really favors the young. I mean, as you get older, this becomes very easy. Kind of been there, done that. But when you're young, you're like, wow, I'm about to make something that I interact with every day. Like my parents need to use this kind of e-commerce every day. I'm going to make that. That's a huge leap forward for young people and students to do. For really anybody. And practical people anywhere. So that's the way that we decompile these exhibits, these examples. So let's just go back to the docs. The docs I find are the easiest place to get some code that can work. So here, that's very simple, where you have a div, and that's this surrounding box, and then you have email address, that's just a label, so that's a label. And then you have an input, and an email type will necessitate there being an @ symbol there. So if you have an @ symbol, if you don't have an @ symbol, it will actually give you an error. Does that make sense? So that's great. So that validation, it's of type email. So the validation for the field is built into the HTML. At this point, we haven't shown you any JavaScript yet. So JavaScript has the ability to validate fields, but also HTML5 and Bootstrap 5.2 also have field validation built in. So it actually will save a little bit of labor. It's intellectually easy to make HTML that self-validates. There's a little placeholder there. And I would just love to have you guys fool around with this. And indeed, fooling around, hacking around with it, that's a requirement. You really have to try it and see what it does. And that's a great way to understand what each of these little pieces are. Great, this is different sizing, whether it's disabled or enabled. And they have huge numbers of variations here. I think that's a password type. So that's what you should work on today is the inputs. And then if you want to go forward, if I can just give you kind of the foreground for the next lecture, is we also want to have a button. And so if you think about how buttons really work, let's go to the example. Here you have a world-class example. And you have a big fat button, which is buy it, the buy button. And there's a lot of psychological study that it has to do with what makes people press the buy button, what makes people finalize the purchase. And you guys will be able to experience some of that where you're saying, well, how do we prompt the user to complete the purchase? A lot of users get to this point in the shopping cart and they won't complete. And so they won't complete the transaction. It's actually the moment of truth where all of your hard work comes down to a button and whether the user will finish that, will complete with that button. It's actually a big deal. The hundreds of billions that go into e-commerce every year, that takes place because people they press a button. Does that make sense? You guys get over the hump right there.
I always thought that Amazon, I don't use Amazon too much, but my sister does a lot. And I noticed that they have that buy with one click option. You know, I asked my sister, I'm like, being honest, I'm like, you click that button more than you ever go to the checkout. She's like, oh yeah, because it's just one button, you just click it, it's done.
It's a remarkable thing, that buy button. You know, it's just buy with one click. The Amazon people, I think, are the only people that do that, and they were the first to do it. They've been doing it for a while, and I think your sister is just the latest in a long line of people to adopt it, because once they have the trust of that person, they just want to make it easier. And so I think if you move to Seattle, Seattle is less of a technical innovation place, but it's more of a consumer product innovation space, where, for example, they didn't invent coffee, but they made Starbucks. They didn't invent big box retail, but in Seattle they made Costco. You know, they didn't invent the web page, but they made Amazon. I think there's a particular genius that's a part of the Seattle area that is about product design, and it's about humanizing a product. So I think what's great about California is that California is really the innovation area, where you have the biotech, you have the computer sciences, you have the electronics, but you have other places in the world that learn how to humanize it. A place like South Korea, companies like Samsung that are good at making it human. Does that make sense? It's very actually somewhat rare in Silicon Valley that you have human factors corporations like Apple, where, and frankly, you could argue that Apple is better at human factors design than anyone else. But I think if you guys go to Seattle, that's a great place to spend time because people are really thinking about how do I make this business really work in the hands of the consumer. Silicon Valley may bequeath us a lot of the great libraries and a lot of the great machine learning and the underlying tech, the really high-end alpha stuff, but I think you need the second-tier cities like the Seattles and the Austins where people are thinking about human factors. And that's a very rich area for business students to be engaged in. What are the psychology of the buyer? And a lot of computer science students need to consider these things as they exit their heavy physics, calculus, computer science curriculum. They need to be thinking about the human factors component. But let's say this, that's a little miniature lecture free of charge, but as you mature into this industry, you begin to consider these human factors. So I'm not going to, we could talk about it for the next 10 weeks. I'm not going to do that. In fact, this is all I'm going to say about it, But let's say this. Here you have your button, and what happens with the button? That's the consumer putting their money on the line. It's a trust factor. A lot happens there. So there's only one button. So the button, how do you code the button? The button works like that. You're going to have in Bootstrap a row, and then you may have a, here at the end here, oh, the button's at the very end. Then you have the button class, primary, large button, type submit, continue to checkout. Now, because it's a submit, we can attach methods to that button. So we can actually have JavaScript that are listening for submit methods. And also we can say submit and we can specify the method at that time. So buttons are normally connected to JavaScript firing. So okay, so from here we have a good example that's hard to interpret. And why don't we go ahead and look at, you have input group, that's bodies of text inputs. And then let's look at buttons. And I'm trying to move fast. I'm not trying to move slow. I'm trying to keep you engaged, but I'm encouraging you to watch the video. This is going to be recorded, and then pause. And then go on a little mission, go and work for 10 minutes on it, go back to the video. That's the way to learn. But you can see all the types of buttons and all the source code that makes this accessible. So I could copy all of this and get all these buttons. So the key is to say, well, how do I want my button to look? These are gorgeous. Look at that hover. The sizing. What do I want things to look like? This is like, it's clear that Apple has adopted the bootstrap styling. It used to be that Apple would kind of prescribe style. Now they're absorbing style. And bootstrap is, who is prescribing the style and who is absorbing it? Clearly Apple over time has absorbed a lot of the bootstrap into their website. The most influential design company in the world. So, you guys are participating in that design culture when you do this. Little tiny button, disabled buttons, buttons that aren't working quite yet. Link functionality caveat. Okay, we'll see what that is. Gigantic block buttons. Huge blocks. They're 100% or 80% of the width. So you guys can go shopping as to the buttons that intrigue you. But let me say this. As you guys make design decisions within this project and others, and once you get into the button, you're almost done. As you make design decisions, you're appealing to consumer tastes. You're speaking to the aesthetics and the value of the user. People in America and within the developed world and the developing world, they are obsessed with taste. They want very much to have the things at their fingertips appeal to them. And this is something that you and I need to accommodate. We need to accommodate that notion of consumer taste and understanding that taste is what is going to drive acceptance. Does that make sense? So if you can live with that, you can get over the fact that it's another round of work that we're going to do. But again, this is why Bootstrap is so meaningful, is we need to make things that have appeal, that have taste, that look good, rounded corners and the like. And we can do so without a whole lot of struggle if we are literate in responsive frameworks like Bootstrap. So good. Do you feel like you have enough to get started? This is not as much a definitions class, it's a how to hack class. It's how to grab something and begin working with it. But you guys have enough fundamentals to do that. So this is kind of where you're at. So what you do is grab some HTML, slam it into your page, give a look at it, select the pieces that you want, and then begin the orchestration process. And then begin the dialogue with me as to how do I resolve these errors.